The mathematics were simple enough: $17.40. 3 nights at a cheap boarding house if she bargained well. One ticket to Denver, second class, if she found the right window at the right ticket counter. Beyond Denver, the numbers stopped adding up, and Clara Whitfield had learned from her father that numbers which stopped adding up were trying to tell you something important. She sat in the third-class car and looked at the figures she had written in the margin of her small notebook, the same notebook she used for everything, the same one that had traveled with her from Boston through Chicago and through the flatlands of Wyoming, and now up into the mountains of Montana Territory, where the train moved slower because the grades were steep and the rails were new, and the whole enterprise of connecting civilization to wilderness felt at certain moments like exactly the kind of ambition that ended in catastrophe. The train was running 4 hours behind schedule. A rock slide on the northern pass had forced a 6-hour delay at a water station outside Missoula, and Clara had spent those 6 hours sitting on a wooden bench with her valise between her feet and her notebook open on her knee, doing what she always did when she was frightened. She worked. She had reread Seth Vance's advertisement 3 times in those 6 hours. Not because she had forgotten the words, because the words were the only thing she was traveling toward, and she needed to believe they were real. The advertisement had appeared in the Boston Herald on the 14th of April, tucked between a notice for a clockmaker seeking apprentices and a lengthy announcement about a temperance lecture at Faneuil Hall. It was 4 lines long. It said that a rancher in Montana Territory sought a mail-order bride, that educated women with practical sensibilities were preferred, that the rancher valued good judgment above all other qualities, and that passage would be paid for the right candidate. Clara had folded the paper carefully along the edge of those 4 lines and carried it home in her coat pocket and sat with it at her father's old desk for a long time before she wrote her first letter. Her father had been dead for 5 months by then. The house on Marlborough Street had been sold to pay debts that Clara did not believe were entirely real debts that had appeared on paper with the signature of Raymond Fitch, her father's business partner, who had continued to be seen at the Athenaeum and at the better restaurants and at the Christmas concert at Trinity Church, looking comfortable in the way that men who have taken what does not belong to them often look comfortable because no one has yet found the mechanism to make them uncomfortable. Clara had looked at those numbers too. She had sat with her father's ledgers for 3 days after the funeral and traced every column and every entry and found the places where the math stopped adding up in ways that were not accidents. She had brought what she found to a lawyer on State Street who had listened patiently and then explained with genuine kindness and genuine uselessness that without the original bank records and without a signed affidavit from a certified accountant, there was very little that could be done. She was 21 years old and she was a woman and she had no certification and no standing, and Raymond Fitch had all 3 of those things and the deeds to her father's accounts besides. So she had folded the newspaper advertisement and carried it home and written her first letter to Seth Vance of Harlan Creek, Montana Territory. Not because she was running away, because she was going somewhere that might need exactly what she had. Her father's voice in her memory, as it often was in the quiet moments, Clara, a number never lies. The person using it might, but the number itself is always honest. Learn to hear what the number is saying, and you will always know more than the person who thinks they are hiding something from you. She closed her notebook and looked out the window. The mountains had come up around the train, the way walls come up in a room you have walked into without knowing what room it is. One moment the land was open, brown grass and sage, and the occasional cluster of cottonwood along a creek bed, and the next moment there were peaks on both sides close enough that she could see individual trees on the lower slopes, pine and fir, standing in the blue shadow of the afternoon. The sky above the peaks was a particular shade of blue that did not exist in Boston, a blue that was too large and too clean and too indifferent to everything underneath it. She had never been this far west. She had never been further west than Albany, which did not really count as west at all. $17.40. The train pulled into Harlan Creek at 10 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, 4 hours and 10 minutes behind schedule. Clara gathered her valise and her notebook and her coat and waited in the aisle while the other passengers collected themselves and moved toward the doors, and she did what she had been doing for the last hour of the journey. She prepared herself, not for the best possibility. She had learned early that preparing for the best possibility was how people got hurt. She prepared for the realistic possibilities ranked by likelihood. Seth Vance was still at the station and was, as his letters had suggested, practical, honest, capable of being reasoned with. Or Seth Vance was no longer at the station because the train was 4 hours late and he had a ranch to run and she would need to find the boarding house and send a message and wait. Or Seth Vance had changed his mind entirely, in which case she had $17.40 and needed to start using them carefully. She stepped off the train into the late afternoon light of Harlan Creek and looked at the station. It was not a large station, a wooden platform, a small building with a ticket window, two hitching posts with horses tied to them, a water barrel, a bench. The town itself was visible from the platform, one main street running perpendicular to the tracks, wooden storefronts on both sides, a church steeple at the far end catching the light. Above and beyond the town on every side, the mountains. She stood on the platform and looked for a man holding a sign with her name. She found two men instead, no sign. But the younger one with auburn hair, the color of turning leaves and warm brown eyes, and the kind of open face that either meant genuine good nature or a very accomplished performance of it, was holding a folded piece of paper and looking at the passengers coming off the train with the focused attention of someone looking for a specific person. The older man stood beside him with his arms crossed and his hat pulled low and his eyes already moving along the platform in a way that suggested he had already found what he was looking for and was already deciding what to do about it. Clara looked at the younger one's folded paper and started walking. The younger man saw her coming and straightened up and smiled. It was the kind of smile that reached his eyes without effort, the kind that cost nothing to give and meant something because of it. He unfolded the paper. The name Whitfield was written on it in large block letters. Miss Whitfield. His voice was easy and warm and not at all like someone who had been waiting 4 hours in the summer heat. I'm Noah Vance. Welcome to Harlan Creek. He extended his hand and she shook it, and then she turned to the man beside him. Seth Vance was taller than she had expected and harder in the face with dark blonde hair and green eyes that were doing something complicated. He was not looking at her the way men sometimes looked at women arriving on the train, with that particular combination of assessment and appetite that Clara had learned to recognize and ignore. He was looking at her with something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with her at all, as though he had looked at her face and found something there that belonged to a different story, one that had ended badly. She recognized that look too, though she had rarely been on the receiving end of it. It was the look of a man who had decided something before he finished thinking about it. Mr. Vance, she said. Seth Vance looked at her for 2 more seconds. Then he looked at his brother. Take her to the boarding house. His voice was flat and not unkind and completely without opening. Mrs. Cole's place on Elm Street. Noah's expression shifted. Seth, the ranch doesn't need the extra hand. He said it without looking at Clara again, as though the conversation had already moved past her. She can stay the night and take the morning train back. There are moments in a life when the thing you feared most happens and you discover that the fear was worse than the event itself, because the event is just a fact and facts can be dealt with, and fear is the story you tell yourself about facts before they arrive. Clara stood on the platform of the Harlan Creek station and let the fact arrive and did not add a story to it. I understand, she said. Her voice was level. It cost her something to keep it level, but the cost did not show, and Clara had long experience of keeping costs from showing. Seth Vance glanced at her once more. Something flickered in his face too fast to read, and then it was gone, and he was walking toward the far end of the platform where the horses were tied. Noah was looking at her with an expression she would come to know well in the weeks ahead, the expression of a man who was genuinely, personally sorry for something that was not his fault. Miss Whitfield, I'm so sorry. He doesn't... He stopped. There's no good way to explain this right now. There's no need to explain it, Clara said. Shall we go? She picked up her valise before he could reach for it. Not because she was angry, because she was not going to arrive at the boarding house of a town she did not know needing someone to carry her bag for her. She had $17.40, and she needed to start from whatever solid ground was available. They walked toward the main street of Harlan Creek, and Clara looked at the town around her as she walked, cataloging it the way she cataloged everything, the way her father had taught her to catalog everything. The bank was on the corner of the main street, and the cross street, a solid 2-story brick building that looked newer than the wooden storefronts around it, which meant money had been spent on it recently, which meant someone had reason to want it to look substantial. A general store, a hardware dealer, a land office, a hotel with a sign that needed repainting. A woman in a blue calico dress watching them from the doorway of what appeared to be the boarding house half a block down. What Clara did not know, what she had no way of knowing as she walked down the main street of Harlan Creek with her valise and her $17 and her determination to make the best of whatever ground she had, was that at that exact moment, a man was stepping out of the brick bank building behind her. He was a tall man and a well-dressed man, and he moved with the particular ease of someone who had not been surprised by anything in a long time, because he had arranged things so that surprises were unlikely. He stopped on the bank steps and watched Clara walking away from the station with Noah Vance, and he watched with the still calculating attention of a man who was adding up his own numbers. His name was Gordon Aldrich. He went back inside. The boarding house was run by a woman named Miriam Cole, who was perhaps 48, and who had the broad shoulders and direct eyes of someone who had been managing things alone for a long time and had made her peace with it. She looked at Clara for approximately 3 seconds when Noah introduced them, and then she looked at Noah. "She'll need the room at the window that faces the mountains," Miriam said, "not the one facing the alley." "Yes, ma'am," Noah said. It was. Clara thought a small kindness, but small kindnesses from strangers have a particular weight when you have just been refused by someone who was supposed to know you, and she felt it. She was sitting on the edge of the bed in the room with the window that faced the mountains, trying to decide what her next 3 moves were, when she heard boots on the stairs and then a knock at her door that was different from Noah's knock. Heavier, more deliberate. She opened the door. The man in the doorway was the tallest person she had seen since arriving in Montana Territory. 6 feet and 4 or 5 inches, at least, with the kind of build that came from years of actual physical labor, rather than the kind that came from sport or vanity, broad through the shoulders and lean through the middle, with a face that had been weathered by sun and wind into something that could have been 30 or could have been 50, but was, she would later learn, 32. His eyes were the color of good whiskey held up to a lamp. His hair was dark brown with lighter threads in it from the sun. He had a scar on his right shoulder that was visible at the edge of his collar, old and well-healed, the kind left by something serious. He was holding his hat in his hands. "Miss Whitfield?" He had a voice that was low and unhurried and did not waste itself. "I'm Elias Vance, Seth's older brother." She had not known there was a third brother. The advertisement had been signed with Seth's name only. "I saw you walking from the station," he said. "I was coming out of the bank." She waited. "I need to ask you something," he said, "if you'll permit it." "Ask." He asked 3 questions. Not how was your journey, not what were you expecting to find here, not the polite questions that served as insulation between strangers. He asked how many years had she worked with ledger books. He asked, did she know how to read a land survey? He asked, did she understand how a bank loan could be restructured in ways that changed the collateral without the borrower clearly understanding what they had signed? Clara felt something happen in her chest that was not quite hope and not quite recognition, but was in the territory between them. 8 years, she said, with ledgers, yes to the survey and yes to the restructured loan. My father was a bank accountant for 23 years. I sat beside him from the time I was 14. Elias Vance looked at her for a moment with those amber eyes that gave very little away. Do you have references? I have the ledger books my father taught me on, she said. I have 8 years of practical knowledge that no school in this country currently teaches to women, certified or otherwise. And I have the fact that the man who was supposed to be my intended husband just sent me to a boarding house after a 3-day journey without explanation. A pause, which means, she said, that I am currently in a position where a fair offer is a fair offer, and I am not in a position to turn down fair offers. Something shifted at the corner of Elias Vance's mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the acknowledgement that a point had been made. He made her an offer that was in fact fair. 3 months of work as the ranch's accountant and financial manager. $20 a month paid on the first of each month in coin. A private room in the main house. Meals with the family. At the end of 3 months, she could leave with her earnings and her return passage paid, or she could decide to stay on in whatever capacity made sense. No obligations beyond the work itself. I'll need full access to the financial records for the past 5 years, Clara said. And the original land documents, not copies, originals. He looked at her the way she imagined a man looked at someone who had just named something he had not known he needed until it was named. Agreed, he said. Then I accept. He put his hat back on. I'll let Noah know. We leave for the ranch in half an hour if that suits you. It suits me fine. He was almost to the stairs when she spoke again. Mr. Vance. He turned. What is the problem with the finances? She asked it directly the way her father had taught her to ask questions when she already suspected the answer. You wouldn't have made this offer to a stranger if it weren't serious. Elias Vance was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, Harlan Creek went about its afternoon business horses and wagons, and the distant sound of a hammer from the direction of the hardware store. The bank is telling me I owe money I don't remember borrowing, he said, and the numbers in the ledgers don't sit right with me, though I couldn't tell you exactly why. He paused. My father built that ranch on 400 acres and grew it to 6,000. He paid every debt he ever owed. I've tried to run it the same way. He was not asking for sympathy. He was stating a record that he believed in and intended to defend. Give me the ledgers, Clara said, and I'll tell you what the numbers are actually saying. He nodded once and went down the stairs, and Clara sat back down on the edge of the bed and looked at the mountains through the window for a long moment, and then she picked up her valise and began to unpack what she needed. The ride to Vance Ranch took 40 minutes by wagon climbing west out of the town, through pine forest, and then down into a valley that opened up like a held breath finally released. Clara sat in the wagon bed with Noah beside her and watched the landscape change and said very little, which seemed to suit everyone. Seth Vance rode separately on horseback, staying ahead of them on the road and not looking back. The ranch appeared when they came over a low ridge, and Clara had the involuntary thought that it looked like something that intended to still be there in 100 years. The main house was 2 stories of hand-hewn pine logs with a wide covered porch along the front, solid and functional and somehow exactly the right size for the landscape around it. A large barn, a bunkhouse, several smaller outbuildings, a garden plot along the south side of the house fencing that ran east toward the creek and west up toward the tree line. Through the middle of it all ran Harlan Creek itself, not large but clear and cold and loud enough to hear from the wagon road, a sound that Clara realized immediately was the sound of money to anyone who understood what water meant in this country. 6,000 acres, Noah said. The southern pasture runs all the way to the ridge line. The north pasture goes up into the timber. Dad staked the original claim in '58 and spent 15 years expanding it. And the creek runs the full length of the property. South to north, never runs dry even in drought years. Dad always said the creek was worth more than the cattle. Clara looked at the creek. She was beginning to understand something about this valley, about why it mattered to certain interests that the family currently occupying it might find themselves unable to sustain that occupation. But she filed that understanding away carefully the way she filed everything until she had the numbers in front of her to confirm it. The man who cooked for the ranch was named Clem, a compact and weathered figure of 50 who regarded Clara's arrival with the neutral expression of someone who had seen ranches gain and lose various kinds of help over the years and had decided long ago to reserve judgment until evidence arrived. He served supper at the long kitchen table at 6 o'clock, a meal of beef stew and cornbread that was plain and good and efficiently produced, and the 4 of them ate it in a silence that was not quite comfortable, but was at least not hostile. Noah asked Clara about Boston. She answered briefly and accurately, describing the city as she had known it, dense and layered and cold in winter, full of libraries and institutions, and the particular kind of ambition that grows where old money and new education sit next to each other and produce people who believe very strongly in the importance of things that are primarily invisible. Elias ate without speaking, but Clara noticed that he listened. He was the kind of listener who did not signal that he was listening, who kept his face toward his plate and made no sounds of response, but who absorbed everything. She had known one other person like that, her father. Seth also said nothing, which was different from Elias's silence. Elias was quiet because he was attending to things. Seth was quiet because he was maintaining a position. After supper, when Noah had cleared the dishes and Elias had gone out to check the horses, Seth stayed at the table with his coffee. Clara was wiping down the counter because standing still when she was thinking hard made her feel like a clock with a stuck hand, and because the counter needed wiping. You should know, Seth said to the room, generally not specifically to her, that I haven't changed my mind. Clara did not stop what she was doing. About what specifically? About any of this. Your brother made me an offer that was fair and that I accepted, she said. Your mind about it doesn't affect the terms of the arrangement. A pause. I'm not interested in your charity, Seth said, and I'm not interested in whatever Elias thinks he's doing. Clara set down the cloth and turned to look at him directly. This was something her father had also taught her: when a person needed to understand that they were being heard, you looked at them. Seth Vance, she said, keeping her voice entirely neutral. I didn't come 3,000 miles for charity. I came because your advertisement suggested you needed someone with good judgment, and I have good judgment. And it appears I am going to be given 3 months to demonstrate that. If you prefer to spend those 3 months distrusting me, that is your right. But I'd suggest it's also a waste of your time, and from what I can see, you don't strike me as a man who wastes things unnecessarily. Seth looked at her. His green eyes were not warm, but they were not cruel either. They were careful in the way that eyes are careful when the person behind them has learned that what looks true is not always true. We'll see, he said. He stood up and went outside, and Clara turned back to the counter and finished what she was doing and did not let herself think about what she had seen in his eyes, which was not hostility, but was something more like the memory of hostility, the scar left by a wound that had not fully healed. Elias had stacked the 5 years of ledger books on the small desk in her room, along with a set of the land survey documents bound with string and marked with the year they had been filed. He had left no note and no explanation, which was itself a form of trust. He had brought her here to read these things, and he was allowing her to read them without standing over her shoulder while she did it. She sat down at the desk and lit the lamp and opened the most recent ledger and began. For the first 20 minutes, she read in the general way she always began, with unfamiliar books, getting a sense of the handwriting and the organization in the categories used, learning the personality of whoever had kept the records. The ranch's books had been kept by Elias himself. She could tell from the handwriting, small and angular and precise, the writing of a man who had taught himself bookkeeping from manuals and had decided that precision was the most important quality. The entries were consistent and legible and covered everything a working ranch would need to track: payroll, feed costs, veterinary expenses, equipment proceeds from cattle sales, maintenance, tax payments. It was, in its way, a portrait of a life. 20 minutes of reading told her that Elias Vance ran his ranch the way he did everything else, carefully, without waste, with a clear sense of what mattered and what did not. And then she found the first one. It was in the 1876 book, a payment of $220 to something called Western Range Consulting Services, dated the 14th of March, annotated as Land Boundary Assessment Professional Services. The entry was in a different hand from Elias's, slightly rounder letters, slightly different ink, and it bore a bank authorization stamp from Harlan Creek Bank. Clara looked at it for a long time. She turned back 3 pages to the entries that preceded it and forward 3 pages to the entries that followed it. The handwriting around it was Elias's. This single entry was not. She went back to the beginning of the 1876 book and read forward more slowly now, the way she had learned to read when she was looking for something specific but did not yet know exactly what it looked like. She found 2 more entries like the first before she reached June services from companies with substantial sounding names, bank authorization stamps, amounts between $100 and $250, none of them in Elias's handwriting, none of them cross-referenced anywhere else in the ledger. Then she set the 1876 book aside and picked up the land survey documents. The parcel number on Elias's ownership certificate, filed with the Montana Territory Land Office in 1858 and reconfirmed in 1867, was 479. Elk Creek Valley, Northwest Quadrant, 6,020 acres with water rights attached. She opened the most recent bank correspondence file, which Elias had included in the stack of documents, and found the notice of debt that had apparently precipitated the current difficulty. The parcel number listed on the bank's records as collateral for the outstanding loan was 472. Clara held the 2 documents side by side under the lamp, 1 number apart, 7 and 2. In a hand that might have been tired or careless, or in a hurry, those 2 numerals could look similar. Anyone reading quickly might not notice. Anyone reading without the original survey document to compare against would have no way to know. But they were not the same parcel. She was certain of this immediately and completely with the certainty that came not from emotion, but from the accumulated habit of 8 years of reading numbers and knowing what they meant and knowing what it meant when they didn't mean what they were supposed to mean. Parcel 479 was Vance Ranch. Parcel 472 was something else entirely. Somewhere else entirely belonging to someone else or to no one. And the debt that Harlan Creek Bank was currently threatening to collect, the debt that had arrived with its 30-day deadline and its talk of collateral seizure, was attached to Parcel 472. The Vance family was being sued for a debt attached to land they had never owned. She sat with this for a long time, turning it in her mind the way her father had taught her to turn a problem before she named it, checking it from different angles, looking for the interpretation that was simpler and less alarming. There was not one. She looked at the clock on the small mantel. It was past midnight. Outside the window, Harlan Creek Valley was dark and silent, under a sky full of stars that had no equivalent in any sky she had seen before. She thought about her father. She thought about Raymond Fitch and his comfortable smile and his clean hands and the way the numbers in her father's books had been adjusted subtly and systematically in a hand that was not her father's hand. She thought about the brick bank on the corner of Harlan Creek's Main Street, newer than the buildings around it, and the well-dressed man she had not yet been introduced to but had seen watching from its steps. She opened a fresh page in her notebook and began to write. At 5 o'clock in the morning, Elias Vance came downstairs to find Clara already sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp burning low and 2 sheets of paper laid out in front of her with columns of figures and references carefully noted. She had made coffee, he saw. There was a cup waiting beside the pot. He sat down across from her without speaking, and she turned the papers toward him. "This is the parcel number on your original ownership certificate," she said, pointing to the first column. "This is the parcel number on the bank's debt records." She pointed to the second. "They are different parcels." Elias looked at the numbers. He looked at them in the way he looked at everything, without rushing, without performing a reaction. She waited. "That can't be an error," he said finally. "No. Someone changed it. Someone added entries to your ledgers using a different hand," she said. "And someone changed a single digit in your parcel number in the bank's records. I can tell you what they changed. I cannot yet tell you exactly when, though I have some ideas about that. And I cannot yet tell you who specifically, though I have a theory about the mechanism." Elias set down his coffee cup and looked at her with those amber eyes that gave nothing away, and also somehow gave everything away, because what they communicated with complete clarity was that he was taking what she had just said entirely seriously. "What do you need?" he asked. "The original survey documents from when your father first filed the land claim. Not these copies." She tapped the stack on the table. "The originals. Whoever has them, wherever they are." "Henry Aldwell has them," Elias said. "He was the surveyor when my father filed in '58. He retired to Helena 4 years ago." "Then we need to go to Helena." A pause. Outside, the first light was beginning to separate the mountains from the sky. Somewhere in the barn, a horse moved and settled. "How certain are you, Elias asked. She looked at him directly. "Certain enough to say it to you. Not yet certain enough to say it to anyone else. The difference between those two things is whatever is in Helena." Elias nodded once. It was the nod of a man who had just made a decision, not a man who was considering making one. "I'll arrange for someone to cover the ranch for 3 days," he said. "We leave day after tomorrow." He stood and picked up his cup and went to stand at the kitchen window, looking out at the valley as the light came into it slowly, the way it does in mountain country, beginning with the peaks and working its way down. Clara looked at his back and thought about the number on the bank document and the number on the deed and the single digit between them. She thought about her father's voice. "Clara, a number never lies. The person using it might, but the number itself is always honest." Then the back door opened, and Seth Vance came in from the early morning, already dressed for work, smelling of horses and cool air. He looked at Clara at the table, and then at Elias at the window, and then back at Clara. Something moved in his face too fast to catch. "What's happening?" he asked. Elias turned from the window. "Clara found something in the books." Seth looked at her. She watched him decide whether to ask and watched him decide to ask. "What?" she told him. Briefly, directly, the same way she had told Elias. The parcel numbers, the unmatched entries, the basic structure of what appeared to have been done and what it would mean if she was right. Seth stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment after she finished. He did not look at her with the careful, closed expression he had used the night before. He looked at her with something different, something that was not yet trust, but was the beginning of the question that comes before trust. "You're sure about the numbers," he said. "I'm sure about the numbers," Clara said. "I have never been wrong about numbers." He said nothing to that. He poured himself coffee and went to stand beside his brother at the window, and the two of them looked out at the ranch in the early morning light. 6,000 acres of everything their father had built and everything they had continued building, and the creek running through it cold and clear, and entirely indifferent to what certain people in a brick building in town were planning to do with it. Noah came down 20 minutes later, found them all in the kitchen, and looked at the papers on the table and the expressions on everyone's faces and asked what he had missed. Clara told him too. He sat down across from her and read what she had written and looked up at her with those warm brown eyes. "How much trouble are we in?" he asked. "That depends on what we find in Helena," she said, "and how much time we have." "The notice gave 30 days, Elias said from the window. "We've used 10. "Then we have 20 left," Clara said, "and I intend to use every one of them." And she picked up her pen and pulled the notebook toward her and began writing the list of things she needed to verify and the order in which she needed to verify them, working the problem, the way her father had taught her to work every problem from the known toward the unknown, following the numbers, letting them lead her to the truth. Outside the window, Harlan Creek moved through the valley in the early morning light, quick and cold and honest. The way water is always honest about where it is going and where it has been, and the mountains stood above the valley, the way they had stood above it before any of them were born, and would stand above it, after all of them were gone, patient and enormous, and entirely unconcerned with the question of who owned what on the ground below. That question for the moment was Clara Whitfield's problem to solve. She had 20 days. She had a pen and a notebook and 8 years of her father's teaching and the single-minded attention that came from wanting more than she had ever wanted anything to do this right. She got to work. The wagon left before sunrise. Elias had arranged it quietly the way he arranged everything, without ceremony and without explanation to anyone who did not need one. He told Seth and Noah that he and Clara would be gone 3 days. He told Clem to keep the kitchen running and told Dex to make sure the north fence line got checked before the weekend. He loaded the wagon with what they needed for the road and hitched the 2 bay horses while it was still dark. And when Clara came out of the house at 4:30 in the morning with her valise and her notebook and the folder of documents she had been working through for the past 2 days, the wagon was already waiting. They did not talk much in the first hours. The road out of the valley climbed east through pine forest that was black in the pre-dawn and then slowly greening as the light came up, and the horses moved at an easy, steady pace that suggested they had made this road before and had an opinion about the best way to travel it. Clara sat on the wagon bench with the document folder on her lap and watched the mountains change color as the sun rose behind them, first gray, then purple, then a deep amber that made the limestone faces look like they were lit from within. Her father had never seen Montana. He had never been west of the Hudson River. He had spent his working life in ledger rooms and bank offices in the careful, contained world of numbers and accounts, and he had made that world feel larger than it was by the quality of his attention to it. She thought about him often on the wagon road to Helena, more than she had thought about him in months, perhaps, because the ledgers of Vance Ranch had been her first real work since his death, the first time she had sat down with a set of books and felt the particular satisfaction of reading them fully, following every column, finding the places where the story they told was not entirely the story they meant to tell. "You said your father was a bank accountant," Elias said. It was the first thing either of them had said in an hour. 23 years at First Harbor Bank in Boston, she said. He started as a junior clerk and ended as the chief accountant. He understood money the way some people understand music, not just the mechanics of it, the character of it. And he taught you. From the time I was 14, every evening after supper, if there was work to show me, he used to say there was no reason a sharp mind should be wasted on embroidery when there were ledgers to be read. She paused. He was not in certain respects a conventional man. What happened to him, she told him. Not the full version, not with all the weight she had carried since that winter, But the essential facts, the lung illness that had taken him in 6 weeks, the partner who had moved with remarkable speed, once it became clear that Walter Whitfield would not recover the debts that appeared on paper after his death in amounts that did not correspond to any records, Clara could find the lawyer on State Street who had been genuinely sympathetic and genuinely useless. Elias listened without interrupting. She was beginning to understand one of his defining qualities. He listened to the whole thing before he responded to any part of it. "Did you know the partner?" he asked when she was done. "Raymond Fitch." "Yes. He came to supper twice a year. He brought wine and talked about politics and told my father stories about investments that had done well for other people. My father liked him." She looked at the road ahead. "I never liked him. I could not have told you why when I was 15 or 16. I can tell you now. There was a category of number he never discussed. When men in his position talk about their finances, there are always certain numbers they don't mention. The amounts they keep where it's inconvenient to find them. Raymond Fitch never mentioned those numbers. Most people don't notice an absence. I notice absences." Elias was quiet for a moment. "That's what you noticed in our books. An absence and a presence. The entries that shouldn't be there and the original land record that should match the bank's records but doesn't." She looked at him. "The two things together suggest that someone has been very careful and very patient. This wasn't done quickly." "How long?" "I believe the modifications to the ledgers began in 1875 or early 1876. The parcel number in the bank records, I can't say when that was changed without seeing the original filing. That's what I need Henry Aldwell for." Elias drove in silence for another mile. They were coming down out of the timber now into a broader valley, the road widening where it joined a larger track heading east toward the main route to Helena. "I've done business with Gordon Aldrich for 7 years, he said finally. "He's been polite, efficient. I have never had reason to doubt him." "That is exactly how it works," Clara said. "The ones who are careful are polite and efficient and give you no reason to doubt them until the reason arrives all at once." He looked at her then for a moment sideways with those amber eyes that processed things slowly and held them. "You sound certain." "I am certain that something wrong has been done. I am not yet certain who did it or how it was done at every step. Helena will help with that." He nodded and returned his eyes to the road, and the wagon moved east through the morning, and they did not speak again for another long while, but the silence between them was different from what it had been at the start. It had become a working silence, the kind that two people share when they are thinking about the same problem from different angles and each trusts that the other's angle is worth considering. That evening, they stopped at a way station near the Clark Fork River, a rough building with 4 rooms to let, and a cook who made biscuits that were better than they had any right to be given the conditions of the kitchen. They ate at a table with 2 other travelers, a mining engineer heading north, and an elderly woman going to visit her daughter in Helena, and the conversation was general and harmless, and Clara was grateful for it because the day had been long, and her mind needed a rest from the specific problem, and the way station gave her that. After supper, Elias sat on the porch while Clara went to her room to write up the day's notes, and when she came out an hour later to get air, he was still there. The river was audible from the porch, a steady sound that was not quite music, but had the quality of something repeated and reliable. "My father used to sit outside in the evenings," Elias said. Not to her specifically, more as though he was thinking aloud and she happened to be present for it. After supper, before he went to check the stock, he said it was the only part of the day when the ranch was quiet enough to think in. She sat down on the other end of the porch bench, leaving a proper distance between them. "He sounds like he was a deliberate man," she said. "He was. He decided everything slowly, and then he didn't revisit it. He used to say that a decision you revisit was a decision you made badly the first time." A pause. "He would have liked the idea of someone like you looking at the books. He always felt the money side of things was the part of the ranch he understood least." "Most people who are good at building things are not necessarily good at the accounting of them," Clara said. "The skills are different. One is about materials and labor and weather and time. The other is about what those things kiss and where that cost appears on paper and whether the paper matches the reality. And you're good at knowing when the paper doesn't match." "I am good at that," she said. Not modestly and not with pride, just as a fact. He looked out at the dark shape of the river below the road. I want to ask you something. Ask. When you go to Helena, when you find what you're looking for, if you find it, what happens then? Then we have evidence, she said, evidence that can be presented to a court. And if the court doesn't listen, she was quiet for a moment. This was the question she had been asking herself since the first night in her room at the ranch, since she had sat with the two parcel numbers under the lamp and understood what they meant. What if no one listened? What if the evidence was clear and irrefutable, and the man behind the scheme was too well positioned for the evidence to matter? She had been here before. Not in Montana, not with a ranch at stake, but with the same fundamental question. What if you were right and it made no difference? I don't know the answer to that yet, she said honestly. I know what I can find and what I can prove. What happens after that is not entirely up to me. She looked at him. But I know this: the best weapon against someone who uses numbers dishonestly is someone who reads numbers accurately. They have the advantage of position. We have the advantage of the truth. I have found in my limited experience that truth has a way of being persistent even when it is inconvenient. Elias Vance looked at her for a long moment in the dim light from the way station window. Then he said, "My father would have liked you very much." It was, she thought, the most he had offered her of himself since they had met, and she received it in the spirit it was given, which was the spirit of a serious man paying a serious compliment. They reached Helena the following afternoon. It was a bigger city than Harlan Creek by an order of magnitude loud, with the commerce of a territorial capital, its streets full of wagons and horses and men in suits alongside men in work clothes. The whole apparatus of ambition and administration crammed into a mountain valley and conducting its business at volume. Clara looked at it with the evaluating eye she brought to everything, and noted the banks, of which there were several, and the law offices, of which there were more, and the land office building on the main street with his territorial seal above the door. Henry Aldwell lived in a small house on the western edge of the city, where the streets quieted and the lots were larger, and old cottonwoods grew close enough together to make a kind of ceiling over the road in summer. He was 72 years old, compact and deliberate in his movements, with white hair and the careful eyes of a man who had spent 50 years measuring things and believed that measurement was close to a moral act. When Elias introduced Clara and explained why they had come, Henrietta Aldwell looked at her for a moment with an expression that she recognized as the expression people wore when they were deciding whether to trust someone they had just met. She met his gaze directly and said nothing, which was what her father had always said to do in that situation. Let the person decide at their own pace, and let them know by your stillness that you are not in a hurry and have nothing to hide. He went inside without a word. He was gone for 10 minutes. When he came back, he was carrying a roll of oilskin-wrapped paper bound with a leather cord that had darkened and cracked with age. 1858 survey, he said. Clark Fork Tributary Watershed Northwest Quadrant. I remember every survey I ever did, but I still keep the records. He set it on the table on the porch and began to unwrap it. A surveyor's records are his reputation. You don't throw away your reputation. He unrolled the map carefully, weighting the corners with river stones that were sitting on the porch railing as though they had been placed there for exactly this purpose. Clara leaned over it and found the section she needed, her finger moving across the old paper until she reached the parcel markings. Parcel 479. Vance Homestead Claim filed 1858, expanded 1862 and 1867. Signed in H. Aldwell, licensed surveyor, Montana Territory. She took the bank document from her folder and placed it beside the map. Parcel 472. Henry Aldwell looked at both documents. He looked for a long time. Then he straightened up and looked at Elias. I never surveyed Parcel 472 in connection with your father's land, he said. It doesn't exist in my records as part of the Vance claim. Never has. He looked at the bank document again. Someone changed a number. Yes, Clara said. This is your collateral on record with Harlan Creek Bank. According to the bank, yes. Henry Aldwell was quiet for a moment. Then he went back inside and came out with a pen and a stack of notarized statement forms and sat down at the table and began to write. I'll give you a sworn affidavit that the original survey is as marked, that Parcel 479 is the Vance Homestead claim, and that no survey I ever conducted connects Parcel 472 to the Vance family's land. He looked up. I assume you need this before a judge. Within 3 weeks, Clara said. You'll have it today, he said and kept writing. They were back on the road before supper time. The affidavit folded carefully in Clara's document folder, alongside the surveyor's copy of the 1858 map, both notarized before a public notary on Helena's main street, witnessed by a retired judge, who happened to be visiting the notary's office when they arrived and who had read the documents with great interest and said quietly and to no one in particular that certain things in certain parts of the territory had been moving in a direction he did not care for. The road home was easier than the road out because they knew what they had, and what they had was real. Clara sat with the folder on her lap and felt for the first time since this had begun the particular satisfaction of having found the thing she was looking for, which was not different in its essentials from any other accounting problem she had ever solved, only much larger and with much more at stake. Elias drove and was quiet, but it was a different quiet than it had been on the way out. He was thinking through the implications of what Henry Aldwell had confirmed. She could see it in the set of his jaw and the way his hands held the reins present and steady. He was building a plan. He was the kind of man who, once he understood a problem, completely moved directly to what needed to be done about it. We'll need Fletcher Bryce, he said eventually. The deputy. He's an honest man, stubborn about it, which means he's harder to work around than some. I've known him since we were boys. He paused. He'll need to see what you found. He'll have it. Another mile of road. Clara. He said her name the way he said everything, without decoration, but with weight behind it. Thank you for coming here, for doing this. She looked at the mountains ahead of them, descending now toward the valley where Harlan Creek ran through the Vance family's land. My father told me that the most useful thing a person can do with a skill is use it where it's needed, she said. I have needed somewhere to put this particular skill for a year now. I am glad to have found one. She did not say the rest of it, which was that she was glad to have found the specific place she had found. That part was not something she had words for yet, and she had enough of her father in her to know that words that weren't ready shouldn't be forced. They came back to the ranch in the late afternoon of the third day to find Seth waiting at the gate with his arms crossed and a look on his face that said something had happened while they were gone. Someone had been through the ranch office. Clem had noticed it first the morning of the second day, a drawer in the main desk left open a hand's width. When Clem was certain it had been closed the night before, a chair moved slightly from its usual position. The window latch in the back room turned at the wrong angle. Nothing taken. Nothing obviously disturbed. But someone had been in the room and had looked through it. At night, Elias asked. Must have been, Seth said. Nobody saw anyone in the daytime. They were looking for the ledgers, Clara said. Both brothers looked at her. I took them with me. They've been in my folder for 3 days. Seth was quiet for a moment. Then, they know you went to Helena. Yes. They know you were looking. They have known since before we left, Clara said. The visit to the office was either a warning or a failed attempt to take something useful. Since they found nothing, it was probably both. Seth looked at his brother. Something passed between them that Clara could not entirely read, but could approximately translate the acknowledgement that the situation had moved into territory where the usual tools of ranch management were not the relevant ones. Then we move faster, Elias said. Clara was already moving. In the 10 days since the trip to Helena, she had been building the second line of evidence with the patient, systematic attention her father had taught her, interviewing the ranch hands one at a time, in the way that felt least like interviewing, asking about daily routines and workflow, and the small procedural details of who handled what and when. She had found Dex, who was 20 and observant and happy to talk about his work to someone who seemed genuinely interested in it. And from Dex, she had learned that the ranch ledgers had gone to Harlan Creek Bank 3 times in the past 4 years for what Elias had described as routine auditing, and on each of the last 2 occasions, it had been Dex himself who carried them in and picked them up, because Elias had been busy with cattle work and had sent him as a reliable errand. Did you always deal with the same person at the bank? Clara had asked. Mostly Mr. Douglas Carter, Dex had said. He was the one who handled the ranch accounts. He quit in January and left town. Douglas Carter had quit and left town in January 1878, 2 months after the most recent bank audit, and 4 months before the debt notice arrived at the ranch. Clara wrote his name in her notebook and drew a box around it. She was sitting in the office looking at her notes on the afternoon of the 18th day. 19 days since the debt notice had arrived, and 11 days before the hearing, when she heard the sound of a horse in the yard, and then voices at the front door, and then Clem's voice saying that Mr. Aldrich had come to call. She did not move from her chair. She listened. Elias was not at the ranch. He had gone out that morning with Seth to look at the fence line along the south pasture, a 2-hour ride that had turned into a longer one when one of the hands came to find them about a section that had come down in the night. Noah was in the barn. Clem brought Gordon Aldrich through to the office where Clara was the only person available to receive him. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and his three-piece suit without a speck of dust on it, despite the July heat and the fact that he had presumably just ridden from town. His smile was the kind of smile that offered itself to everyone in a room, equally the nonspecific goodwill of a man who had learned that approachability was a tool. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," she said. He sat down across from her uninvited, but not as though uninvited with the easy assumption of welcome that she was beginning to understand was itself part of the technique. He asked after her health and after her impression of Montana Territory, and whether she was finding the ranch work to her liking, and she answered each question briefly and accurately, and she watched him the way her father had taught her to watch people when they were talking about something other than what they had come to talk about. He was building up to something. She could feel it in the measured pace of the small talk, the way he was timing it, and she let him time it because she wanted to hear what it was. "I've heard that you've been doing some financial work for the family," he said eventually. The word financial landed with a lightness that was slightly too careful. "Mr. Vance asked me to review the records," she said. "I've been doing that." "A useful skill," Aldrich said, "although I imagine the books here are rather simpler than what you were used to in Boston." "Every set of books has its own character," she said. He smiled at that. "Quite right." A pause timed perfectly. "I want to speak frankly with you, Miss Whitfield, if I may, as someone who has the family's best interests at heart." She said nothing. She let the silence sit. "The situation with the loan is not as complicated as it may seem from inside it," he said with the tone of a man explaining something gently to someone who has been worrying unnecessarily. "These matters are often the result of paperwork getting ahead of itself, accounts being structured in ways that aren't entirely transparent on first reading." He leaned forward slightly. "What I'd hate to see is a young woman putting herself in an uncomfortable position by drawing conclusions from documents that require more context than she has access to." "What kind of uncomfortable position?" Clara asked. "Harlan Creek is a small town," Aldrich said. His voice remained pleasant. "It's easy for misunderstandings to follow a person, particularly someone who is relatively new to a community. I would not want your work here to create impressions that might make things difficult for you." He paused, and the pause was the most precise thing he had done since he walked in. "Particularly when there are people in this territory who have a great deal of experience with land, law, and financial regulation who might see things quite differently from how they appear in a ranch office." Clara looked at him. She felt the temperature of the room change in the way rooms changed when something real had just been said under the cover of something polite, and she understood with complete clarity what she was being told. She was being told to stop. She was being told that continuing would cost her something. She was being told by a man who was accustomed to telling people these things without ever technically having said them. "I appreciate your concern," she said. He held her gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, just long enough to make sure she had received the message, and then his expression relaxed back into general pleasantness. "I hope the family is well," he said, standing. "Please give my regards to Elias." He left. Clara heard Clem showing him out and the sound of his horse leaving the yard. She sat with her hands flat on the desk and breathed carefully and let herself feel what she felt, which was a cold, specific anger that was not going to be useful right now and needed to be set aside and underneath the anger, something that was harder to name, something that had to do with her father and Raymond Fitch and the lawyer on State Street, and every single time in her life that a man who was in the wrong had presented himself with the confidence of a man who was in the right. She picked up her pen. She did not hear Seth come in. He moved quietly for a large man, and she had been focused on her notes. She became aware of him standing in the doorway behind her only when he spoke. "How long was he here?" She turned. Seth was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hand and the expression of a man who had heard the last part of something and was calculating what the first part had been. 15 minutes, she said. "What did he say?" She told him, not with any particular emphasis or editorial, just what had been said in the order it had been said, the way she reported everything accurately and completely. Seth listened without moving. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the middle distance in the way that meant he was processing something rather than looking at anything in particular. He came here while Elias was out, Seth said. Yes. He knew Elias was out. I believe so. Seth set his hat on the table near the door. He crossed his arms, which was his habitual posture, but this time it did not read the way it had read in the first days as a wall or a refusal. It read as a man containing something that was working to get out. 2 years ago, he said, a woman came to Harlan Creek. She was pleasant, and she asked questions about the valley and about the ranch, and I told her things I should not have told her because I thought she was asking out of genuine interest. 3 months later, a land speculator out of Helena filed a competing claim on the southeast corner of our grazing land based on boundary information that could only have come from someone who had heard it from me. He paused. The claim was false and it failed, but it cost us 2 months and a lawyer's fee. She was paid to get that information. I didn't know that until after. Clara did not say anything. She recognized this as the kind of telling that required a listener, not a responder. I looked at you at the station, Seth said, and I saw her. I knew it wasn't you. I knew it while I was deciding, but I decided anyway because deciding felt safer than trusting again. He looked directly at her now, and his green eyes were doing something different than they had done in the first days, something that cost him to show. What I just heard from you about what he said in here. He came while Elias was gone, and he told you to stop, and he told you there would be consequences if you didn't. He paused. That is not what a man with nothing to hide does. No, Clara said, it isn't. What do you need, he said. 3 words in the tone of a man who has settled something for himself. I need to know when the ledgers went to the bank and who handled them on both ends, she said. I have some of that. Dex was the courier on the last 2 trips, but I need to know if there's a way to verify that Douglas Carter was the specific person who modified the parcel number. The ledger entries I can argue were added after the audit. The parcel number change is harder because the bank's original records would have had to be physically altered. Seth thought about this. Carter lived in the boarding house on 2nd Street before he left. Miriam Cole knows everyone who lives in her building. She might know something about Carter and who he was in contact with. Then I need to talk to Miriam Cole. He nodded. I'll take you into town tomorrow morning. He picked up his hat and went back out, and Clara looked at the place where he had been standing in the doorway and thought about what her father would have made of Seth Vance, who had been wrong and knew it, and said so without ceremony, and then asked what he could do to be useful, and she thought her father would have respected him considerably. Noah had been quiet about going to town the following week to deliver copies of the documents to Fletcher Bryce. He had not made an announcement about it. He had simply said at breakfast that he was heading in and would pick up the hardware supplies they needed, and he had taken the saddlebag with the document copies tucked inside alongside the hardware list, without anyone making much of it. Clara had watched him ride out and had thought that Noah Vance was under his easiness and his warmth a more deliberate person than he usually let people see. He came back in the late afternoon on a different horse. His own horse walked behind riderless. He came in through the kitchen door with a split lip and a rib that made him move carefully, and he set the saddlebag on the table and said, "The documents are with Bryce. Both copies." Clem poured him a glass of water without being asked. Seth was on his feet before Noah had finished the sentence. Who, Seth said. 2 men on the road out of town, about a mile past the creek crossing. Noah touched his lip. They wanted the bag. I didn't give it to them. Elias came in from the hallway. He took in Noah's face and the saddlebag on the table and the careful way his youngest brother was standing. Are you hurt? He said. Ribs. I'll be fine. The one on the left will be limping for a day or 2. Noah almost smiled. You taught me something teaching me how to throw a punch when I was 12. Seth looked at his brother and then at the saddlebag and then back at his brother, and the thing moving across his face was the particular helpless anger of a man who loves someone and cannot retroactively protect them from something that has already happened. Bryce has both copies, Noah said again, because it was the thing that mattered. The originals are in the floor safe. Whatever they were trying to do, they didn't do it. Elias looked at Clara. She nodded. This is acceleration, she said. They're not trying to negotiate anymore. They're trying to prevent us from reaching the hearing. 5 days, Elias said. He was looking at Noah, but she understood he was talking to all of them. We have 5 days. What happened in those 5 days was a kind of sustained pressure that Clara had not experienced before, though she recognized it from descriptions she had read and from what her father had occasionally told her about the way financial pressure worked when it was applied deliberately. Every day brought something. A message from the bank's attorneys requesting clarification of documents, a visit from a territorial land office representative who was polite and inconclusive and clearly serving interests that were not the territories. A rumor that reached them through Miriam Cole that the hearing had been moved to an earlier date which turned out to be false, but required half a day to confirm as false. And then 4 nights before the hearing, Fletcher Bryce rode out to the ranch after dark with news. The attorneys representing Harlan Creek Bank, acting on behalf of Pacific Summit Railroad Company, had filed a supplemental set of documents with the court. Among those documents was a letter apparently written by Harold Vance in 1874, in which he requested a loan extension using the full landholding as expanded collateral, signed in his name with a notarization from Harlan Creek Bank. Harold Vance had died in September of 1873. Clara read Bryce's description of the document twice. She set the paper down on the kitchen table. The four of them were sitting there, all four of them, Bryce having come inside and accepted coffee, and they were all watching her. 1874, she said. That's what it says, Bryce confirmed. Harold Vance died in 1873, Clara said. September 14th, Noah said quietly. I was 15. The letter is dated February of 1874, Bryce said, 5 months after he died. The kitchen was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the creek ran through the valley in the dark, and somewhere in the timber, an owl moved and was silent. They made a mistake, Clara said. She said it with the same tone her father had used when he found something in a ledger that looked like it was intended to be hidden, not triumphant, but precise. The tone of someone who has found the exact thing they were looking for in the place they hoped it would not be. Everyone looked at her. They prepared a forgery, she said. They prepared it carefully, and they prepared it well. But they gave their forged document a date after the man who signed it was already in the ground. She looked at Elias. Do you have your father's death certificate or any record of the date? The church register, Elias said. And there's a death record filed with the county. Bryce pulled county records 2 weeks ago. Bryce was already nodding. I have it, he said. Pulled it as standard procedure when I was building the file. Harold Vance, deceased September 14, 1873, cause recorded as heart failure. Witnessed by Dr. William Marsh, filed October 2, 1873, with Lincoln County. Then we walk into that courtroom with the letter on one side of the judge's desk and the death certificate on the other, Clara said. And we asked the court to explain how a man signed a letter in February of 1874 when his death was filed with the county in October of 1873. Seth put his hands flat on the table. He looked at the ceiling. Then he exhaled slowly, the exhale of a man who has been holding something for a long time and has just found unexpectedly that he can set it down. Bryce looked at Clara with an expression she had seen before on the faces of men who had not expected to be surprised by her capabilities and had been. How did you know they'd make a mistake like that? Because the most careful forgeries are the ones made by people who believe they are smarter than the person who will examine them, she said. And because they have been operating without anyone examining them closely for several years, they stopped expecting to be caught. When people stop expecting to be caught, they make exactly this kind of mistake, a small one barely visible that is entirely fatal. She stood up and went to the counter and refilled her coffee cup. And when she turned around, Elias was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something open and direct, and a little complicated, the expression of a man who is fully present and has stopped being careful about whether that shows. The night before the hearing, the four of them sat on the front porch in the dark. The mountains were invisible against the sky. The creek was audible. The valley held the warmth of the day and released it slowly into the night air. And the stars overhead were the same stars that had been there since before any of this had started, indifferent and enormous and beautiful in their indifference. Noah was the one who spoke first, which was fitting because Noah was often the one who said the thing that everyone else was thinking but had decided not to say. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, "I want to say this now. We fought this the right way. Whatever the outcome, I can live with the outcome if we did it right." Seth said nothing, but he nodded once slowly, which for Seth was the equivalent of a lengthy speech. Elias looked at Clara. "Is there anything else you need before tomorrow?" "Nothing," she said. "I have what I need." "You said once that you'd never been wrong about numbers." "I said that." "Are you still certain?" She thought about her father. She thought about the ledger on his desk and the evenings with the lamp burning low, and his hand showing her where to look and what to look for and how to know when a number was lying. She thought about the two parcel numbers that were one digit apart and everything that single digit had been carrying all this time without anyone noticing. She thought about a dead man's signature on a letter dated 5 months after his death. "Yes," she said, "I am still certain." Elias looked out at the dark valley for a long moment. Then he looked back at her with those amber eyes that gave nothing away and also gave everything away. "Then tomorrow," he said, "we go tell the truth." The creek ran on in the dark. The stars held their positions. The valley was quiet in the particular way that a place is quiet when the people in it have stopped fighting themselves and started simply being ready. Clara looked at the mountains she could not see, but knew were there the way she knew things. She had not yet confirmed, but was certain of the way she had always known the difference between what the numbers said and what the numbers meant. And she let the certainty settle through her like a plumb line finding true. Tomorrow the court would hear it, and the numbers would not lie. The morning of the hearing came in cold for August. Clara noticed this when she stepped onto the porch at 4:30 to get air before the day began, a habit she had formed at the ranch without realizing she was forming it, the way you form habits in places that suit you. The mountains were beginning to separate themselves from the sky, first as deeper darkness and then as shape. And the creek in the valley below was audible in the pre-dawn quiet, its sound carrying further in the cold air than it did in the warmth of the afternoon. She had slept 4 hours. This was enough. Her father had always said that the night before important work was not the time for sleep, but for verification, and she had spent the hours before sleep doing exactly that, going through each piece of evidence in the order she intended to present it, checking for gaps and inconsistencies, the way a carpenter checks joints before the weight goes on them. There were no gaps. The structure was sound. She went back inside and dressed carefully in the navy traveling dress she had arrived in, which was the best thing she owned and which she had pressed the evening before. She pinned her hair properly and checked the document folder twice and went downstairs to find that Clem had made coffee without being asked and that Elias was already at the kitchen table in a dark suit that she had not seen him wear before, sitting with his hands around a cup and looking at the window. He looked up when she came in. "Ready," he said. "Yes," she said. She poured coffee and they sat in the kitchen in the early morning and did not say much because everything relevant had already been said and what remained was only the doing of it. Noah came down at 5:30 with his good shirt on and the careful movements of a man whose ribs were still remembering the week before. Seth came down last, dressed plainly and precisely, and he looked at Clara when he came into the kitchen with the same look he had used on the porch during his long, quiet admission in the office, the look of a man who had settled accounts with himself. They drove into Harlan Creek before 7. The courthouse was a single-story building on the north end of the main street. Newer than most of the town and more deliberate in its construction, as though whoever built it had wanted to make the point that law was a permanent institution rather than a temporary convenience. By 7:30, when the Vance wagon pulled up outside, there were already horses tied at the rail and people moving toward the door. Miriam Cole was standing near the entrance when they arrived, her good shawl on despite the early hour, her expression the expression of someone who had come to bear witness to a specific thing and intended to do so thoroughly. She looked at Clara when they came up the steps and gave a single nod that communicated several things at once, none of which needed to be said. Fletcher Bryce met them in the entry hall with the document case he had been keeping at his office, the copies of all Clara's materials preserved and accounted for. He was a serious man, Bryce, with the quality that certain lawmen had of seeming larger than his actual size, something in the way he held himself and looked at things. He shook Elias's hand and looked at Clara with the professional respect he had been extending her since the night at the ranch when she had explained the implications of the dead man's letter. "Aldrich is already inside," he said quietly. He brought his attorney from Helena, Harrison Webb. I know the name, Clara said. Webb is good. He's very good. Bryce paused. But he doesn't have your material. They went in. The courtroom was filling steadily. Harlan Creek was not a large town, and this was the most consequential legal proceeding within living memory, and people had arranged their Mondays accordingly. The Vance family took their places at the defendant's table. Across the aisle, Harrison Webb arranged his documents with the precise, unhurried confidence of a man who had done this many times in many courtrooms and had developed an efficient process for it. Beside Webb sat Gordon Aldrich, composed and well-dressed, and carrying the stillness of a man who believed the day's outcome was already decided. Clara looked at him once across the aisle and then did not look at him again. She did not need to read his expression. She needed to read the judge. Harold Prescott came in at 9 o'clock, and the room rose and settled. He was a lean man in his 60s with gray hair and a face that had been looking at difficult situations for a long time and had developed a characteristic expression for them, which was the expression of someone who was neither surprised nor entirely pleased. He looked at both tables and opened his ledger and said that court was in session and that the matter before them was the civil proceeding of Harlan Creek Bank versus Elias Seth and Noah Vance concerning a disputed debt claim and related matters. Harrison Webb presented first. He was everything Fletcher Bryce had worn, methodical and thorough and convincing in the way that well-prepared men with established credibility are convincing before they have been confronted with the specific thing that undermines them. He laid out the bank's position in careful sequence, the history of the Vance family's accounts at Harlan Creek Bank, the documented progression of loans and extensions, the outstanding balance in its relation to the collateral on record. He spoke about the debt as though it were a settled matter of arithmetic, a thing that had simply accumulated through the ordinary processes of ranch finance and now required settlement. He presented the supplemental documents with the composed assurance of a man who expected them to land as final. The Harold Vance letter was the last document he produced. He read a portion of it into the record and placed it on the judge's bench and stepped back, and Prescott read it with the methodical attention of a man who took documents seriously. Clara watched the judge read. When Webb sat down, Prescott looked at the defense table. "Mr. Vance," he said. Elias stood. "My brother and I would like to ask the court's permission to have our financial consultant present our response," he said. "Miss Clara Whitfield, who has reviewed the complete records in question." Prescott looked at Clara. His expression registered and processed and evaluated in the space of a few seconds. "Counsel," he said to Webb, "any objection?" Webb stood. He looked at Clara with a brief assessment that she recognized as the look of a man recalibrating his expectations. "On what basis is Miss Whitfield presenting?" "On the basis of 8 years of professional experience in financial accounting," Elias said, "under the instruction of Walter Whitfield, chief accountant of First Harbor Bank of Boston, Massachusetts for 23 years. Prescott looked at Clara again. "What is your purpose in these proceedings, Miss Whitfield?" Clara stood. "To present a factual analysis of the documents at issue and to demonstrate that the debt claim against the Vance family is built on records that have been altered and that the collateral described in those records belongs to land that the Vance family has never owned." The room was quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something has been said that everyone present immediately understands as significant. Prescott looked at the letter from Harold Vance still sitting on his bench. Then he looked back at Clara. "You may proceed." She had thought about the order many times. Her father had always said that presentation was strategy that you built toward the most devastating point, the way a carpenter builds toward the joint that will carry the most weight. You start with what cannot be disputed. You give the other side nothing to interrupt until the foundation is so solid that the walls will hold against whatever comes. She began with the parcel numbers. She placed the two documents on the judge's bench in parallel, the original survey and the bank's collateral record, and explained in clear language what each number meant and what the difference between them meant. She cited Henry Aldwell's affidavit, which Prescott read fully before she continued. She explained that parcel 479, the Vance homestead claim, was a matter of 20-year territorial record, and that parcel 472, the parcel described as collateral, in the bank's current legal action, had no documented connection to the Vance family in any public record she or anyone else had been able to find. Webb objected twice. Both times, Prescott allowed him to be heard and then asked Clara to continue. She presented the analysis of the ledger entries, the ones in a hand that was not Elias Vance's hand, with ink that was not consistent in age with the surrounding entries on the same page. She was precise about what she could confirm and what she could not. She did not claim more than she could substantiate. Her father had taught her that the temptation to overstate was the most dangerous temptation in any presentation, because one overstatement gave the other side everything they needed to cast doubt on everything else. The entries I have identified appear to have been added after the ranch's ledger books were returned from their most recent bank audit in December of last year, she said. I cannot confirm in this proceeding who specifically made those entries. I can confirm that they were not made by Elias Vance, based on comparison with his documented handwriting across 5 years of records, and that they appear on their face to represent expenses that the ranch's other financial records provide no corroboration for. Prescott was taking notes. This was a good sign. Judges who were dismissing something did not take notes on it. Then she turned to the letter. She placed the Harold Vance letter and the Lincoln County death certificate on the judge's bench side by side, and she said the letter produced by Harlan Creek Bank's attorneys bears the date of February 11th, 1874. The Lincoln County death record filed with the county on October 2nd, 1873, and witnessed by Dr. William Marsh confirms that Harold Vance died on September 14th, 1873. She stopped there. She let the room do the arithmetic. Prescott looked at the two documents. He looked at them for a long time. Then he looked at Harrison Webb. "Counselor," Prescott said, and his voice had changed in the particular way that judges' voices change when they have moved from evaluating to concluding. "I would like an explanation of how a document bears the signature of a man who died 5 months before the date on that document." Webb stood. He was still composed, still professionally even, but something in his composure had become the composure of maintenance rather than of ease. He said that the bank's records were extensive and that clerical errors were possible in the dating of documents, and that he would need time to review the original. Counselor Prescott said, "You presented this document as evidence of a binding financial obligation. You are telling me that you do not know whether the date on it is accurate." Webb said that he was saying no such thing, that he was simply requesting an opportunity to verify. "The date on the death certificate is not in question," Prescott said. "The date on the letter is on the letter you produced. Either Harold Vance signed a document after his death, which is not possible, or the document was prepared by someone else and given a false date. I do not see a third interpretation." He looked across the room at Gordon Aldrich directly and for long enough that every person in the courtroom followed his eyes. "I am going to suspend this proceeding pending a full investigation of the documents submitted by the plaintiff, to be conducted with the cooperation of the county sheriff's office and the territorial land registry." He looked at Fletcher Bryce. "Deputy Bryce, I would like you to ensure that Mr. Aldrich remains available for a formal interview." The gavel came down. The room broke into the immediate human noise that follows something significant, the release of held breath, and the beginning of conversation. Clara stood at the defense table and felt the exact sensation her father had once described to her, which was not triumph, but was the simpler and more durable feeling of a thing being set right. It was quieter than triumph. It lasted longer. She gathered her documents without hurrying. It was Miriam Cole who reached her first coming through the press of people from the gallery, and she put her hands on Clara's shoulders and looked at her with the expression of someone who had needed to see exactly this and had seen it. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Outside the courthouse in the August light, the four of them stood on the steps while the town moved around them, some people coming to shake hands, and some people giving them room, and some people watching from across the street with the complex expressions of communities processing something they had not expected. Noah let out a long, slow breath. Seth stood with his arms uncrossed, which was still after weeks notable enough to mark. He walked to where Clara was standing and stopped in front of her. He was taller than she had fully registered before, or perhaps she was simply more aware of the space he occupied now that the space he usually occupied with the resistance was not occupied that way anymore. "Clara Whitfield," he said. She looked at him. "I was wrong about you from the first day," he said. "Not as a performance of humility and not as a speech, but as a statement of a fact that he had arrived at through evidence the same way she arrived at things. I knew it before I'd finished deciding it, and I decided anyway. That's not something I can explain in a way that makes it reasonable. I know why you decided it, she said. I know you do. That doesn't change it. He looked at her directly, the green eyes clear and without their customary armor. What you did in there, what you've done in the past 4 weeks. I've been watching him all of it. He paused. I'm glad you didn't go back on the morning train. He put his hand out. She looked at it for a moment. The hand that should have been offered on the station platform 5 weeks ago and had not been. She took it and they shook hands, and it was the simplest possible gesture and also not simple at all. Noah was watching from 6 feet away with the expression of a man who was deeply satisfied about something and was not working very hard to conceal it. Elias was watching too with that expression of his that gave little away but gave something, and what it gave was the look of a man who has just confirmed something he had begun to hope was true. The weeks that followed were not quiet, but they had a different quality than the weeks that had preceded them. The investigation opened by Prescott's order moved through the territorial system with the deliberate pace of official processes gathering and documenting and cross-referencing. And as it moved, it found what Clara had found in the same order she had found it and confirmed it with the authority of the court. Douglas Carter was located in Bozeman. He had left Harlan Creek with a considerable sum of money that he had not earned from his bank salary, and when the territorial deputy arrived at his door and explained what had been found and what the likely consequences were, he made the practical calculation that was available to him and agreed to provide a full accounting of his role in exchange for consideration from the court. He had been the mechanism by which the ledger books of the ranch's accounts had been modified during the periods they were held for audit. He had not understood the full scope of what Aldrich was doing with the information, or so he said, though Clara had her own opinion about the extent of his understanding. Gordon Aldrich was arrested on the 17th of September. Clara heard about it from Fletcher Bryce, who rode out to the ranch in the afternoon to tell them. He said it matter-of-factly the way Bryce said most things, standing in the kitchen with his hat in his hands while all four of them listened. Aldrich had been taken into custody at his office at the bank, and a federal telegraph had been sent to Pacific Summit Railroad's main office in Denver, informing the company that their representative in Harlan Creek was under arrest for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit land theft. The company's response, which arrived within 18 hours, was to deny any connection to Aldrich's activities and announce that they were withdrawing their interest in land acquisition in the Harlan Creek Valley. Bryce said this last part with the look of a man who found the denial entirely unsurprising and entirely unconvincing, and then he drank his coffee and rode back to town. That evening was the first evening in nearly 2 months that no one at the ranch table was carrying something heavy. Clem made a better supper than usual, or perhaps the usual supper tasted better because of what was different in the room. Noah told a story about one of the calves that had gotten itself comprehensively stuck in a stand of timber on the north pasture, a story that became funnier the longer it went on. And Seth laughed once, a real laugh, brief and entirely genuine, and the sound of it was different from what Clara had expected. Lighter than his usual voice, younger. After supper, Seth and Noah went out to check the stock, and Clem disappeared into his domain behind the kitchen with the efficiency of a man who had developed a talent for being elsewhere when elsewhere was appropriate. Clara was at the desk in the office making the final organizational entries in the ranch's corrected ledger when she heard Elias's step in the doorway. She did not look up immediately. She finished the entry she was making because she was nearly done, and because finishing things mattered to her, and then she set the pen down and turned around. He was leaning against the door frame with one shoulder not formally positioned, but present, which was how Elias occupied space with the complete, undemonstrative attention of a man who was exactly where he intended to be. "The books are in order," she said. "I know," he said. "I've been watching you put them in order for 2 months." She waited. He straightened up from the doorframe and came into the room and sat in the chair across from the desk, not the way he sat when they were working, but differently, with a deliberateness that was not about work. He looked at her with those amber eyes that she had been reading for 2 months and had learned to read as well as she read any set of figures, which meant she knew that what was in them now was something he had been deciding how to say for longer than just tonight. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the creek ran through the dark valley and the mountains stood where they had always stood, and the sky was the particular deep blue of a Montana evening going toward night. He looked at his hands briefly, then back at her. I am not a man who finds it easy to say things that matter, he said. I have always believed that what you do is more reliable than what you say. But I have been watching you do things for 2 months, and I think you have earned the right to hear what I would otherwise only show you, and I think I have waited long enough. Clara looked at him steadily. I hired you because I needed someone who could read the books, he said. I knew that from the first minute on the street when I asked you those 3 questions. But somewhere in the course of these 2 months, which I stopped thinking about what I needed and started thinking about what I did not want to lose. He paused. And what I do not want to lose is you. The office was quiet. The lamp on the desk made a small yellow circle of light in the room. Elias Vance, she said. I know the 3 months are not up, he said. I know you have your earnings and your passage home if you want them. I am not asking because the ranch needs a bookkeeper. I am asking because I wake up in the morning and the first thing I think about is not the cattle or the weather or the fence line, and that has never happened before in my life. He looked at her directly. I am asking if you would consider